So welcome back, welcome to this lesson, the history of financial markets. As mentioned in the previous video, wherever there is a transaction, we can say there is a market. But probably the first transaction between humans happened ages ago, long before we were even able to register these transactions. In this lesson though, we're going to discover what we have been able to register and how financial markets shape themselves over the last centuries. Let's jump in. So 4 brief topics. Where did the market start? We're going to talk about the Merchants of Venice, which is also a cool film, by the way, starring Al Pacino, but that's a small side note. If you're interested in that, check that out. The Dutch East India Company, one of the first and biggest companies in the world. More details on them a little bit later. And we're going to look at financial markets today. Just briefly though, again, as with all the lessons, there is extra material attached to this, which discusses these topics further. So we do have some proof of recorded transactions, and one of the first ones dating back all the way to around 2400 before Christ in Mesopotamia. And this was actually a bond, meaning an indebtment of the bond issuer to the bond holder. Now we'll jump into what bonds are at a later stage and check out the term base to see what the bonds are, check the definition. But remember that when a person or company or government wants to raise money, they can do so by issuing a bond. And this bond is a registration and proof of transaction and shows that, for example, you have lended funds to the issuer of the bond. Often the lender or holder of the bond receives interest while holding the bond, and in that way benefits. More on bonds later, however. So the first recording is a clay tablet that stated that the issuer of the bond was to pay the lender in grain, which at the time was the currency. Super interesting. And should the issuer fail to do so, the bond would ensure right to reimbursement. And voila, we have here the birth of the very first bond market. The bond markets will have their separate video, but that in a nutshell is a brief introduction. And the next important event in history is the issuing of war bonds by the city-state of Venice to the public. The city-state, it was a city-state at that time, needed funds to finance their war efforts, and they did so by issuing bonds. There they are again. The cool thing about these bonds is the fact that they paid a fixed rate of 5%. So as a bondholder, you would earn 5% on holding them. And they were tradable. So I want to introduce another way of describing a bond there. A bond can be described as tradable debt. And this was already starting to look more like modern day bond and stock markets. Now, I'm going to fly through history here, but I really encourage you to explore the history of financial markets further. But the next event, which is considered to be the birth of modern day financial markets, is the public issuing of shares in a company. And this happened in the beginning of the early 1600s and was done by the Dutch East India Company, in Dutch also known as the VOC or VOC. So what did they do? Well, the VOC issued shares of their company to the public. And right there, the first initial public offering was born. And that's an event where a private company issues shares of its company to the public and in this way raises money. And by buying these shares, investors were entitled to a share of the company's profits in the future. Another important term that I'm going to introduce here is that a share of a company's profits to investors is also called a dividend. So it's mutually beneficial. The company raises funds and can expand their company. For example, in this case, they could buy new ships. They could hire more people to go on the travels to the Far East to get spices. And if you were an investor and you had some money spare, you can give them the money and you were promised a return on investment later in time. If that always happens, no, it doesn't always happen. If a company just isn't profitable, for example, you can imagine that there's also no profit to share to the investor. But this was super successful. It's still, I think, if you look at it in today's terms financially, it's one of the biggest companies ever created with worldwide trading posts. They had their own army. It's really fascinating. So they grew to be the biggest company in the world at the time, to me it's a fascinating story, and it's considered the birth of modern capitalism. Now, whether capitalism is a good thing and whether they at the VOC completely behaved in that time, that is a different discussion altogether. We can discuss that in person or online. It's a cool conversation. But nevertheless, it is a super important event in the history of financial markets. And so, of course, this blossomed into what we know today. Wall Street is very famous. Financial markets get a lot of attention in the news. There are stock markets all over the place, and they are very interwoven. The whole world economy is very interwoven, and we're all depending on each other in that way. And as a consumer or individual, we are all part of these financial markets, whether we like it or not, and whether we are aware of this or not. So that is it for this super nutshell brief history of financial markets. Small recap. They have existed for a long time. They took ages to develop into what they are now, and they are still evolving. And it seems that the speed at which they evolve is exponential, meaning that we innovate and develop faster and faster. And it's at a rate that is almost incomprehensible sometimes as a mere individual. Super exciting stuff. There is much more to read, and we'll share some interesting videos and links that go into each of the topics discussed in this video separately. But for now, I think that's it. We will see you in the next lesson, which is going to be functions of financial markets. See you there.